a lot of people are really, really good at the technical part in 3D, and like their actual 3D skills are much better than mine, and they create these amazing objects and they texture it super well, and it's just this amazing creation. And then yet you look at the final image and it's not that pleasing to look at sometimes. And the reason is because they're so good at the technical part, and then sometimes people struggle with the actual part about capturing that in a pleasing way. And so what I want to show you today is how, basically when I started out in 3D, I had zero knowledge of the technical part. I was just garbage at the actual 3D part of it. But I would use my camera skills and composition skills to my advantage to actually take this pretty much pile of garbage that I'd created and then capture it in a nice, pleasing, easy to look at way with a nice composition and nice lighting. And then, I've created this thing that's like technically very bad, but then in the end looks pretty nice to look at. So that's what I want to show you here is, even if you're not that good at 3D, if you learn some of these things that I'm going to show you here, you can still make good looking images, even if the actual technical part of what you're doing is kind of bad. So what I want to do is just show you some examples of some of the people who have influenced the way I compose my shots, some photographers, and then I'll show you some examples of how that's translated into my work. And then we'll also jump into Blender and I'll show you the exact camera settings that I use sometimes. So all that is going to be in here. Let's start by talking about some photographers that I follow. And the reason I want to, even though we're talking about renders in the end here, I think it's really valuable to follow photographers online, because if you think about what photography is, it's just the art of going out, at least street photography like this. Products and stuff are going to be different, but street photography at least, or landscape photography, is just the art of going out into the world. You're not like creating a new thing. You're just going out and finding an interesting place, and then moving the camera around in a certain way that captures what you're looking at in a pleasing, nice to look at way, right? And so in 3D we get to do that, but we also get the bonus of we get to create the environment to look like whatever we want. It can be anything. So let's analyze some compositions of what some photographers have done here, because I think that is very helpful for getting new ideas and ways of just interesting compositions we could try in 3D in combination with what we've created to capture things in a nice, pleasing, like nice to look at, beautiful way. So this one is by Max Whitehead. These two guys here, Lucan Coots and Max Whitehead, I'll be showing you a lot of their stuff. They've influenced my compositions quite a bit over the last couple of years, so I really like their stuff. But let's talk about what is actually going on here. So there's a few things to look at. The first thing that I usually look at, think about when I'm looking at a composition like this, which I think has been ingrained into me from Blender, but how high up off the ground is the camera, number one, and number two, what angle is it tilted up or down at? So those are going to be probably the most important things, because in Blender we have unlimited freedom of like moving the camera in unlimited directions and unlimited angles. So it's, if we can narrow down our choices of angles and elevations to put the camera at, that'll give us a really good starting point of like some ideas we can try for some nice compositions in our artwork. So if we look at this, the camera is not that high up off the ground, so it's maybe shoulder level of this dude, maybe a little lower, and it's tilted maybe slightly upwards. So if we think about where the horizon would be in this picture, if we kind of just took this ground plane and imagine if that extended way off, where would it cut off and where would the horizon be? It's probably around here, like the bottom 1/3-ish of the image. So it's just the camera's tilted up a little bit. And so what that's doing is, when you look up at something like this, it just kind of makes whatever we're looking at feel, a bit bigger. It just gives it a nice feel. You don't always have to do that, but if you want to achieve like this kind of look, that is the angle they chose. And that's an angle I use quite a lot in my own work, which I'll show you in a second. But so those are the first two things which you can immediately apply in Blender, is just look at good photos, look at the angle and elevation of the camera, and then just kind of replicate that with the Blender camera. The next thing is a bit more to do with not the camera itself, but the way everything else is kind of positioned around it. So if we look at, this is just one of the easy compositional tools you can use in your own work, is using leading lines. So if we look at some of the lines, like just created by objects and stuff in the image, look at this line here, for example, these tread marks that are kind of leading your eye towards a certain point in the image, or like lines along here on this dumpster thing here, or this vertical line that comes down here, or this one down here, or this where the paint is kind of different along this line right here, or this pipe that comes down this way, or this wire that see all these lines kind of all come together and converge on the same point or the same general area. And so that's going to lead your eye to kind of want to follow all of these things, like pointing you and saying, hey, look in this direction. It's kind of just guiding you along to this point right here, which is the person in the bright lights in the middle. So that's a really easy technique you can use in your own work to just enhance the composition. Is just use lines that just point your eye and kind of all converge on a similar point or the same area. And it just makes it look good. It just is pleasing to have those guides to help you figure out where to look. And it just makes it very easy to, like, when you first see the image, it's just easy to look at, and it's just nice and pleasing when all these lines are just pointing you and telling you, hey, look right here. This is where I want you to look, right over here, right? So that's one of my favorite techniques to use. The other technique they're using here is the rule of thirds. So if you don't know what this is, you can just Google rule of thirds. So this is going to be, if you just draw this grid, you've probably seen this before if you turn on the grid on your phone. If you draw this grid, like this imaginary grid over the image, basically what this means is, if you don't know where to start in composition at all, this is one of the rules you can use. You don't always have to use it. I don't recommend always using it, but one option you can do is just line up the important part of your image, like the subject or somebody's eye or the person in the shot, or if you're taking a picture of a horse like this, line up the horse with that point right there. You line it up with where these lines on the grid intersect. So this comes from the golden ratio. It's kind of a simplified version of the golden ratio, but basically if you just line up the important thing with one of these, where these lines intersect with each other, or just where these lines line up on the grid itself, like you can see, you can line up the horizon line with that. So it doesn't have to be just like these points right here, these circles. It could also be just lining up the horizon itself with that, like this. So that's something I use a lot, is just, if you don't know where to place things in the frame, you just use the rule of thirds as a starting point. And then again, like if you line up the most important point, like again, it would be this person's eye here, or their face in general, with one of those points, that'll just give you a good starting point to get a pleasing composition. So that's what they're using that here. I'm not sure if it's exactly on that, where that grid intersection would be, but it doesn't need to be. It's just in that general direction. And that's a nice spot to put things. I don't know why exactly, but it's just using that golden ratio. If you want more info on why that looks good, I recommend just Googling that. Do some research on YouTube to why the golden ratio looks good. But if you want a good starting point, the rule of thirds is that will give you that. And you don't, like I said, you don't always have to use it. I don't always use the rule of thirds. Sometimes I just put things dead center and it looks cool, or outside of where that grid is. But generally, if you don't know where to start, that's a good starting point. It's just, you can turn on the grid in Blender too. I'll show you that right now. If you actually go to the camera, go down to viewport display, and then turn on thirds. So it's viewport display, composition guides, turn on thirds right here. In the viewport, you'll actually get, if I turn that on and off, you can see what that's doing right here. You'll get that exact grid where it splits up your view into, I guess if I rotate it, you can see, turn off center. It'll give you that grid right there. And I also have center on here. But if you line up points of interest with those grid intersections or lines, that'll give you a good starting point. Okay, so another thing to pay attention to when you're looking at other people's compositions and analyzing them and looking at how you can apply that to your own work is focal length. So if you've never used a camera and you don't know what that means, it might sound intimidating, but all it means is just how zoomed in or zoomed out it is. So the focal length number is just going to be a higher number, just means more zoomed in. So in this chart right here, which I'll talk about in a second, 200 millimeters is going to be very zoomed in. Even 100 millimeters is quite zoomed in. 50 millimeters is going to be the default camera in Blender. And then anything less than that is going to be starting to get a little bit wider and more zoomed out. So the higher the number, the more zoomed in. The lower the number, the more zoomed out it is. So you can see here, let's look at this. If you look at, so basically what they've done in this chart right here is they've taken a picture of this guy and they've lined it up in each shot so that his face is taking up the same amount of space in the frame, but they've moved back each shot and zoomed the focal length inwards each shot. So let's look at I'll show you what that actually means. So right here at 20 millimeters, it might not look like too big of a difference if you go look at these one by one, but look at the first one at 20 millimeters and then immediately look at this one in the corner, the 200 millimeter. The guy's face actually looks pretty different in these two shots, and even though they're taking up the same amount of space in the frame. So zooming in and out is actually going to give you a totally different look versus just moving the camera closer or farther. And so it's not like one focal length is better than another focal length. It's just about what kind of look you want to achieve with the picture you're taking. So let's look at this again. So again, what they're doing here to demonstrate this is they're taking a picture zoomed out at 20 millimeters, and they're lining up his face so it takes up this much space in the frame. And then they're taking a step back, zooming it in so that his face takes up the same amount of space, because when you take a step back, it's going to look smaller in the frame. So they just zoom it in to fit the same amount of space. And then again, they move back, zoom in, move back, zoom in, move back, zoom in. And you can see how each time they do that, it's changing the perspective slightly of what this guy's face looks like, because in this picture, they're actually standing much farther away than in the first one. So let's look at some examples of how this applies to environments. So this one is quite zoomed out at probably around 16 millimeters, I'm guessing. And if we look at this one here, this one's zoomed way in at, I think he said in the comments somewhere, 105 millimeters. So that's a pretty big difference. And you can see the kind of look that it gives you. It's just a more flattened, far away look than this one right here. So it just depends on the kind of look that you want to achieve. And it's not like one is better than the other. These are both really nice photographs. It's just a different feeling in both of them. One of the focal lengths that I use a lot of the time is 24 millimeters. It doesn't have to be exactly 24. It could be like 20, 22, 23, 24, 25, in that range-ish. It's going to be, that's one of my favorites to use, just because for my work, I like to kind of have it feeling like you're really in there, like, if that makes sense, like you're kind of part of this experience, if that makes sense. So if I look at this one, for example, when you have a shot at 100 millimeters, it just gives you a look like you're very far away from this thing that you're looking at. It doesn't really feel like you're right up next to this guy right here, right? It's like you're far away looking zoomed in. That's what it is, right? So that's not a bad thing. It just gives you a different feeling than if you have a focal length of like 24 millimeters. Like if you take a picture on your phone, it's probably going to be around 24 millimeters. I think like the human eye, the amount of stuff you can see in your vision, like the camera equivalent would be like around 24-ish, 22-ish millimeters. So that somewhat wide angle is just gonna, to me, it kind of makes you feel like if you were taking a picture, or if you were looking at what this actually looks like, if you were actually there, that's kind of the focal length that you would see things at. So it makes sense to, like, if you want to feel like you're very immersed in this, that's the focal length I like to use a lot of the time. But not always. Like sometimes it looks better to zoom it in or zoom it way out, and you can get really cool and just different interesting results by changing that focal length. So I don't always use that, but it's one that I use quite a bit. It's 24 millimeters. So just play around with it. Like just go into Blender, move the camera back, zoom it in, move it forwards, zoom it out, try different angles, and just see what looks best for the kind of thing that you're capturing. And you can't, there's no way to know what's going to look best until you just basically just try stuff, and figure out what the best focal length and angle is for that specific render. Let's look at some more here, because I think this is good to analyze these. So this one, again, pretty zoomed out. And the way you can tell, I don't know if there's any way you can tell other than you just zoom the camera in and out and just look at what that looks like and the kind of look it gives you. So pretty zoomed out here. It's probably around 18, 20, 24 millimeters-ish. It's hard to tell exactly, but something like that. And if we look at how high up the camera is off the ground, obviously here we're on top of a building or it's a drone or something. So it's a very different feeling than being like right on the ground. Like this one is like right on the ground here. And something like this is going to give you a totally different look. What I like to do, and the kind of mindset I like to have in Blender when I'm taking the final render, when I'm positioning the camera, is like, imagine if you were there in this place in real life. Where would you be standing taking a picture? Or where could you stand to take this picture? So right off the ground is always an easy choice, because if you were, you're going to be walking around on the ground. So if you're walking around and you decided to take a picture, it would be captured from that perspective. It could be standing, could be crouching like this. But another way to do it is like, think about all of the terrain available here. So you can see there's really tall buildings in the distance here. We could be standing on another building or a giant balcony, or maybe it's a drone taking a picture. So if you just position the camera in 3D in a place that would make sense where it would be in real life, that's another good starting point to where you'll limit your choices down to like some more options that make the most sense. Because like I said, in Blender, we have unlimited options of where we can put the camera, and that's kind of overwhelming sometimes. So if you just think about, okay, if I was here in real life, where could I stand to take this picture? Maybe on a balcony somewhere, maybe on top of a building, maybe right on the street. Like if I'm, walking by somewhere and I decided to take a picture, where would the camera be? So that's how I approach it, is if I was there in real life, where would I be standing to take this picture? And that'll just narrow down your options to something that, so you don't have unlimited choices. So again, let's look at some more here. This one, we're using the rule of thirds again on that leading line. So we've got like all these lines leading your eye right to this point right here, this like intersection or bright sign. And same thing, rule of thirds, it's kind of lined up with where that grid is kind of overlapping. If we were to draw that 3x3 grid over this image, that would be right where those lines are intersecting roughly. And if you think about where we are in this image, it kind of looks like the elevation of this camera is maybe on this height of this floor right here. So if we were, standing on some building or parking garage or something on this side, that seems like where this photo would have been taken from, is like that elevation. And then it's kind of actually looking dead on. It's looking straight ahead. And since we have so much room below us, it's not like the ground is like right in the bottom of the frame here. That actually works pretty well. So it's, again, there's no right or wrong angle to choose or right or wrong focal length to choose. It's just about the kind of feeling and like what just happens to work best for the thing that you're capturing. And so let me talk about some of my own stuff and how I've used this. So here's one. I'll show you this one in Blender, but this one is using some of those techniques I was just talking about. We've got some leading lines here, like these up here are kind of pointing you in that direction. Not a crazy amount, but it's a little bit. Even little stuff like this does help and just kind of helps guide your eye in a certain direction. So that's there. The other thing we're doing is the camera's very low to the ground in this one. So it's like, I'll show you the exact settings in a second, but imagine you were crouching or standing in this place. It would probably be about that high. And then we're looking up again. It's tilted upward at this thing to make it kind of feel more menacing and overwhelming. And I called the title of this one Cosmic Dread. So that's kind of the feeling I wanted, like some dread kind of feeling. Like, I don't know. Sometimes the way you place the camera can really help with whatever feeling you're trying to convey in the image. So let's open up Blender and actually look at the exact settings I'm using here. So here's the camera. I put this guy in here just for reference of how tall this is. So if you were standing, I guess it would be, let's see, right there. So if you were standing and you were roughly this tall, there's how high the camera would be off the ground. So it's like if you were crouching down slightly, it would be maybe that high. And so, like I said, the camera's looking, it's not positioned like dead on like this. It's not straight looking forward. It's kind of looking upwards a little bit. And that's helping with this, you know, low down, looking up, kind of gives that menacing feeling. Our focal length here is at 28. I had this lens type on panoramic, but if you look at the difference here, that's not making that big of a difference at all. It's just warping it slightly. So I'll just change it back to perspective for this example. So this one's at 28 millimeters. So I mentioned I use 24 a lot, so there's what that looks like. I just felt like that was a little bit too wide, so I just pulled it in slightly to 28. Still pretty similar in that range though, of like, it kind of feels like if you were actually here in this place, it would roughly look like this from your perspective. That's kind of the feeling I wanted. So 28 just seemed to look best, so that's what I went with. It's not like a magic number. It's just, you literally just move this along and just find an amount that looks good. That's what you do. And the more you do that, the more you'll be able to like get it right on the first or second try versus like trying every single number. But, you know, what I'd recommend is just choose a number, start with 50, start with 24, whatever you think is gonna be best. If it looks bad, try a different number, move the camera around to adjust. If it still looks bad, try a different number, move the camera around to adjust. And you just do that until you find something that looks better than all the other options you tried. So it doesn't have to be complicated choosing camera angles. Like, look at this, it's just like camera, 28, put it, you know, a foot off the ground, 2 feet off the ground, and tilt it up. And then that's the angle I chose. It's dead center. The X transform, the location X is at 0 meters, so it's dead on the, like dead center on the X axis. So pretty simple composition here. It's just the camera tilted up a bit, zoomed out a little bit. And then where you place things in the frame is gonna have a bigger impact on the kind of leading lines and rule of thirds and composition setup you get and balance you get. Yeah, that's like a pretty standard setup for me. It's just keep it simple. And like I said, if you don't know where to start at all, just go and check out these guys. Go follow photographers like this guy Lucan Coots and Max Whitehead. These are some of my favorite photographers, but there's plenty of really, really good photographers on Instagram. You just go and find them and just save a bunch of their stuff. And then, like I said, what you can do is just go analyze the kind of shots they've done. Look at the focal length, like how zoomed out is it? How high off the ground is the camera? How high is it rotated? Or like what kind of tilt is the camera at? Is it off to the side? Is it in the middle? Are there leading lines? Are they using the rule of thirds? Like, just look at all that stuff I just talked about. And I'd recommend watching more videos on composition. I'll leave one by Blender Guru, did a really, really good video on composition and how it applies to Blender. I'll leave that in the description too. I recommend watching that. But I also recommend just look at photographers, and even better, look at photographers and then do photography and go out into real life with an actual camera. And I think that will give you some of the best experience of like how an actual camera works is, you know, using one. And that translates really, really well over into Blender and 3D when you kind of know the limitations and what you can do and what you can't do with an actual camera. And that will help you choose better shots in 3D. So yeah, I think that's it for this one. Hopefully that gives you a better idea of this thing, composition and camera angles. So anyways, yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you around. Bye.